I thought my son's wedding would be the happiest day of my life until my daughter-in-law demanded my house keys in front of 122 guests. When I refused, she slapped me so hard my cheek burned for hours. I walked out with dignity intact and made one phone call. 20 minutes later, a man appeared at the reception hall door. When the wedding party saw who it was, they began to cry. But those tears weren't from joy. 6 months before that devastating wedding day, I was living what I thought was a charmed life. My name is Allison. I'm 65 years old and I've spent the last 30 years building a real estate empire in San Francisco. My Victorian mansion in Pacific Heights, worth $4.2 million, sits like a crown jewel overlooking the bay. The house has been featured in architectural magazines with its original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and wraparound porch that catches the morning sun perfectly. I earned every square foot of that house through blood sweat and sleepless nights. After my husband died when Bradley was just 10, I threw myself into real estate development. I started with a small duplex and gradually built a portfolio of properties that gave us financial security I never dreamed possible growing up in a working-class family in Oakland. Bradley, my son, was 28 and working as a software engineer for a tech startup downtown. He'd always been a gentle soul, perhaps too trusting for his own good. When he called me that crisp October morning to say he was bringing someone special for Sunday dinner, my heart swelled with anticipation. "Mom, her name is Jessica, and she's incredible," he gushed over the phone. "She's studying to be a nurse at UCSF. You're going to love her." That Sunday, Jessica walked through my front door like sunshine itself. She was 26 with shoulder-length auburn hair and warm brown eyes that seemed to sparkle when she smiled. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her figure without being flashy, and she carried a bouquet of white roses. "Mrs. Peterson, these are for you," she said, her voice soft and melodic with a slight Midwestern accent. "Bradley told me you love roses, and I wanted to make a good first impression." I was charmed immediately. Jessica helped me arrange the flowers in my grandmother's crystal vase, complimented the original crown molding in the dining room, and asked thoughtful questions about the antique furniture I'd collected over the years. During dinner, she listened attentively as I shared stories about restoring the house, and she even laughed at my terrible jokes about stubborn contractors. "This house has such amazing energy," Jessica said, running her fingers along the polished mahogany banister. "You can feel the love and care you've put into every corner." Over the following weeks, Jessica became a regular presence in our lives. She'd stop by after her classes, often bringing homemade cookies, or offering to help Martha, my housekeeper, with small tasks around the house. Martha had been with me for 15 years, and she was notoriously difficult to win over, but even she seemed taken with Jessica's helpful nature. "That girl has good manners," Martha told me one afternoon as Jessica organized my spice cabinet without being asked, "respectful and hardworking." Jessica would curl up on my living room sofa with Bradley, and they'd share stories about their childhoods. She told us about growing up on a farm outside Columbus, Ohio, helping her mother with vegetable gardens and learning to can preserves. Her father had died when she was 16, she explained, which was why she understood the special bond Bradley and I shared. "I lost my dad young, too," she said one evening, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It makes you appreciate family even more, doesn't it?" I found myself looking forward to her visits. Jessica had a way of making the large house feel warmer, more alive. She'd bring energy to rooms that had felt too quiet since Bradley moved out. When she started staying overnight on weekends, I was genuinely happy. The guest room down the hall from Bradley's childhood bedroom seemed perfect for her, and I enjoyed hearing laughter echoing through the halls again. Jessica showed interest in everything about our family history. She'd spend hours looking through photo albums, asking about relatives and family traditions. When I mentioned my collection of vintage jewelry, she was fascinated by each piece's story. She seemed particularly intrigued by my grandmother's emerald ring, which had been appraised at $15,000. "It's beautiful," she said, holding it up to catch the light. "Bradley is so lucky to have such a rich family heritage." As autumn turned to winter, Jessica's presence became more constant. She had a key to let herself in when I was at work, and I'd often come home to find dinner prepared or fresh flowers arranged in the foyer. She started making suggestions about redecorating, always framing them as wanting to help me update the space. "This room would look amazing with lighter curtains," she'd say, or, "Have you ever considered opening up this wall to create more flow?" I appreciated her interest, though some of her ideas seemed a bit modern for a Victorian home. Still, her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself considering changes I hadn't thought about in years. One December evening, as we sat by the fireplace after dinner, Jessica broached the subject that would change everything. "Allison," she said, using my first name as I'd encouraged her to do, "Bradley and I have been talking about our future, and we both feel like this house could be such a wonderful place to start a family. Have you ever thought about what will happen to it when you're ready to downsize?" The question caught me off guard, but her tone was so gentle, so caring, that I didn't feel defensive. Instead, I found myself thinking about legacy and family continuity. "I suppose I've always hoped it would stay in the family," I admitted. "This house has so much love in its walls." Jessica's face lit up with genuine joy. "That would be incredible. Bradley and I would treasure it the way you have." That night, after they'd gone back to Bradley's apartment, I sat in my study surrounded by family photos and legal documents. The idea had been percolating in my mind for weeks, but Jessica's words crystallized my thoughts. I wanted her to feel truly part of our family. I wanted her to know that I trusted her with our most precious asset. I picked up the phone and called my attorney, David Harrison, who had handled my legal affairs for 15 years. "David, I want to add someone to the deed of my house," I said. "It's a wedding gift I'm planning." "That's a significant decision, Allison," he replied carefully. "Have you thought this through completely?" "I have," I assured him. "I'll bring her by after the wedding so you can meet her. I want Jessica to know she's truly part of this family." As I hung up the phone, I felt a warm sense of satisfaction. The surprise would be perfect. Jessica would be overwhelmed with joy to discover she was part owner of the house she'd grown to love. It would be my way of welcoming her not just as Bradley's wife, but as the daughter I'd never had. I had no idea I was about to hand over the keys to my own destruction. 3 months before the wedding, the first cracks in Jessica's perfect facade began to show, though I was too blind to see them for what they were. It started with small changes around the house. I'd come home from work to find furniture rearranged without any discussion. My antique secretary desk had been moved from the bay window to a dark corner. The family photos on the mantelpiece were replaced with modern candles Jessica had bought. When I mentioned it, she was quick with explanations. "I thought this arrangement created better flow," she'd say with that sweet smile. "Don't you think it feels more open this way?" I told myself she was just trying to help, that newlyweds naturally wanted to put their own stamp on things. But something felt off about the way she'd make these changes when I wasn't home, presenting them as fait accompli rather than suggestions we could discuss together. Then came the day I discovered her first outright lie. I was having lunch with my neighbor Patricia Hendricks, who mentioned seeing Jessica at the Nordstrom cosmetics counter during what should have been class hours. "I almost didn't recognize her," Patricia said. "She was working there wearing a name tag and everything. I thought you said she was a nursing student." That afternoon, I drove to UCSF's nursing school and made discreet inquiries. Jessica Mitchell had never been enrolled there, not in nursing, not in any program. When I checked the employee directory at Nordstrom, I found her listed as a part-time sales associate in the cosmetics department. My stomach churned with confusion and hurt. Why would she lie about something so fundamental? That evening, when she arrived for dinner with Bradley, I decided to address it directly but gently. "Jessica, dear, I ran into Patricia today and she mentioned seeing you at work. I thought you were in school." For just a moment, her composure slipped. I saw something cold flash in her eyes before the tears began. "Oh, Allison, I'm so embarrassed," she said, collapsing onto the sofa with her hands over her face. "I had to take a leave of absence from the program. My mother's been having financial troubles, and I needed to work full-time to help her with medical bills. I didn't want Bradley to worry about my family problems, so I just kept saying I was going to classes. Bradley immediately wrapped his arms around her, shooting me a look that clearly said I'd been insensitive to bring it up. "Babe, you should have told me," he murmured. "We're a team now." Jessica's explanation was plausible, even admirable in a way. But something about her tears felt calculated, and I noticed how quickly she shifted from embarrassment to making me feel guilty for asking. As the weeks progressed, Jessica's behavior became increasingly possessive. She started leaving personal items throughout the house, her coffee mug in my study, her magazines on my kitchen counter, her toiletries in the guest bathroom. It felt like she was marking territory. She also began isolating Bradley from me, in subtle ways. When I'd suggest our traditional Sunday dinners, Jessica would suddenly have work commitments or family obligations. She'd plan romantic weekend trips for them during times she knew I was hoping to see Bradley. When I did see my son, she'd dominate the conversation with wedding plans that seemed designed more to showcase my house than celebrate their relationship. "We're thinking about having the engagement photos taken in the garden," she'd announce. "And maybe the bridesmaids' luncheon in the dining room. This house is going to be such a beautiful backdrop for everything." Her presumptions about using my home for wedding events escalated quickly. She started bringing her mother Diane around for planning sessions. Diane was 52, recently divorced, and carried herself with a bitter edge that made me uncomfortable. Where Jessica's manipulation was subtle and sweet, Diane's was blunt and grasping. "Some people have all the luck," Diane would say, running her fingers along my silk curtains. "Living alone in a place like this, while so many families are cramped into tiny apartments." When I gently mentioned that the house didn't feel too large for me, Diane would exchange meaningful glances with Jessica. "Oh, of course not," Diane would backtrack. "I just meant it seems like a lot to maintain for one person. So much responsibility." I began to notice Jessica studying the house with new intensity. She'd ask detailed questions about property values in the neighborhood, inquire about my maintenance costs, and comment on how expensive utilities must be. She started taking photos of different rooms, claiming she wanted to remember details for decorating her and Bradley's future home. One afternoon, I came home early from work to find Jessica in my home office sitting at my computer with financial documents spread across the desk. "Jessica," I exclaimed, more startled than angry. "What are you doing?" She looked up with that innocent smile, but I caught a flash of annoyance before she composed herself. "Oh, Allison, I hope you don't mind. I was trying to plan a special surprise for Bradley's birthday, and I wanted to understand the family finances so I could suggest something appropriate. I didn't want to plan something too expensive or too modest." Her explanation made some sense, but the documents she'd been reviewing were property deeds and investment statements, not bank balances that would inform birthday gift planning. "I would have been happy to help you with that," I said carefully. "You didn't need to go through my private papers." "You're absolutely right," she said, gathering the documents quickly. "I should have asked first. I just got so excited about planning something special, and I wanted to surprise you too by handling everything myself." That evening, Martha pulled me aside after Jessica and Bradley had left. "Mrs. Peterson, I don't want to speak out of turn," she said, her voice lower than usual. "But that girl was in your office for over an hour before you came home. She was making phone calls and taking pictures of papers with her phone." My blood ran cold. Pictures of what papers? "I couldn't see clearly without being obvious about watching," Martha admitted. "But she seemed particularly interested in anything with legal letterhead." I spent that night reviewing every document in my office, trying to determine what Jessica might have photographed. Everything seemed to be there, but the violation of privacy felt enormous. More troubling was the realization that she'd had a ready excuse, prepared, suggesting this wasn't an impulsive act, but something planned. Over the following weeks, Jessica's mask continued to slip in small ways. She'd grown more comfortable expressing opinions about my choices, always framed as helpful suggestions. "You know, Allison, this house is really too much for one person," she'd say. "Have you ever considered a nice condo downtown? Think of how much simpler your life would be." When I'd deflect these suggestions, she'd pivot to health and safety concerns. "I worry about you here alone," she'd continue. "All these stairs in the neighborhood can be so isolated at night." She started making comments about my memory, too. If I forgot a small detail about our conversation or couldn't immediately remember where I'd placed my keys, she'd exchange concerned glances with Bradley. "Mom, are you feeling okay?" Bradley would ask after Jessica had planted her seeds of doubt. "Jessica mentioned you seem a little forgetful lately." The wedding planning became Jessica's platform for introducing her extended family and friends to the house. She'd bring groups of people for consultations with wedding vendors, but these sessions felt more like real estate showings. Her friends would comment on the house's value, discuss renovation possibilities, and make observations about how much space it was for one person. "Jessica is so lucky to be joining this family," one friend said during a cake tasting. "This house must be worth millions. What a wonderful inheritance to look forward to." I was beginning to feel like an outsider in my own home. But every time I tried to set boundaries, Jessica would become tearful and apologetic, making me feel guilty for not trusting her intentions. The breaking point came 3 weeks before the wedding. Carlos, my gardener, who'd worked for me for 8 years, approached me with obvious reluctance. "Mrs. Peterson, I don't want to cause trouble," he said, "but I think you should know something." He explained that he'd overheard Jessica on the phone with someone discussing real estate agents who specialized in difficult sales and talking about property staging to maximize value. She was saying things about how the house would show better with less personal clutter and that older owners sometimes need encouragement to make smart financial decisions, Carlos reported. My hands began to shake as the full picture started forming in my mind. That afternoon, I called Bradley's old friend from college, Derek, who worked as a real estate agent. "Derek, this might sound like an odd question, but has anyone contacted you about potentially selling a house in Pacific Heights, a Victorian worth about $4 million?" There was a pause. "Actually, yes. A woman called last week asking for a market analysis. She said she was representing an elderly family member who was considering downsizing. She mentioned the address and I recognized it as your place. I figured you'd asked her to make inquiries." My heart stopped. What exactly did she want to know? Typical questions for a preliminary assessment. Current market value, how quickly properties in that range sell, whether it would be better to sell furnished or empty. She seemed particularly interested in legal aspects of sales involving elderly owners. After hanging up, I sat in my study staring out at the garden Jessica had claimed to love so much. The woman I'd welcomed as a daughter was systematically planning to steal my home, my security, my life's work. But I was far from the helpless victim she believed me to be. I'd built an empire by being underestimated by men who thought they could outsmart me. Jessica was about to learn that this old lady had survived much worse than a manipulative daughter-in-law. The game was about to change, and Jessica had no idea she was playing against a woman who'd been winning battles before she was even born. 1 month before the wedding, Jessica's boldness reached levels that should have alarmed everyone around us, but somehow she managed to make her increasingly outrageous behavior seem reasonable. She'd started referring to our house in casual conversation, not just with Bradley, but with wedding vendors and family friends. When the florist came to discuss ceremony arrangements, Jessica walked through each room like she owned the place. "Our living room has such beautiful natural light," she'd say, or, "We're thinking about updating our kitchen after the wedding." Each time she said "our," I felt a stab of violation, but when I tried to address it, Jessica would look confused and hurt. "I'm sorry, Allison. I guess I just feel so much like family already. Bradley and I talk about our future here so much. I sometimes forget it's still just your house." The way she said, "still just your house," carried an implication that this was a temporary situation soon to be corrected. Bradley seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of his fiancée's behavior. When I attempted to discuss my concerns with him, he became defensive and accusatory. "Mom, I think you're being unfair to Jessica," he said during one of our increasingly rare private conversations. "She loves this house and she loves you. Maybe you're not used to sharing your space, but that's what family does." But she's making assumptions about decisions that haven't been made, I tried to explain. What decisions? Bradley asked, and I realized Jessica had been very careful not to make her presumptions explicit in front of him. She saved the most aggressive behavior for when we were alone or with people outside our immediate family. The isolation campaign intensified. Jessica began scheduling girls' days with her bridesmaids that conveniently conflicted with times Bradley might have spent with me. She'd plan romantic surprises for him during our traditional mother-son dinners, then apologize sweetly for the scheduling conflicts. "I know how important your relationship with Allison is," she'd tell Bradley within my hearing, "but I just get so excited about planning special moments for us." Meanwhile, her research into my personal affairs became more sophisticated and disturbing. I discovered she'd been questioning Dr. Patricia Williams, my physician of 20 years, about my health and mental state during a chance encounter at the grocery store. "Jessica seemed very concerned about your memory," Dr. Williams mentioned during my annual physical. She asked about signs of early dementia and whether there were tests I'd recommend. "What did you tell her?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I told her that patient confidentiality prevented me from discussing your health with anyone, but that if you had concerns, you should come see me directly," Dr. Williams replied. She seemed disappointed by that answer. The most chilling discovery came when I found printed pages hidden behind books in the guest room, where Jessica stayed on weekends. The documents were legal articles about conservatorships, elder abuse definitions, and the process for having someone declared mentally incompetent. There were also printed emails from someone named Harrison Legal Services, offering consultation on difficult family situations involving elderly relatives who resist necessary care. The emails discuss strategies for documenting concerning behaviors and building cases for intervention. This wasn't the same David Harrison who was my attorney. This was a different firm that apparently specialized in helping families take control of elderly relatives' finances. The implications made me physically ill. Jessica wasn't just planning to inherit my house eventually. She was planning to take it from me while I was still alive. I began paying closer attention to her behavior patterns and realized how calculating every interaction had become. She'd ask questions about my daily routines, my medical appointments, my driving habits. She'd express concern about small mistakes everyone makes, but she'd do it in front of witnesses who might later remember her prescient worries about my mental state. "Allison, dear, you put the milk in the pantry instead of the refrigerator," she'd say in front of Martha and Bradley. "Are you feeling tired? Maybe you should consider letting someone help you with grocery shopping." When I'd explained that I was simply distracted by a work call, she'd nod sympathetically but exchange meaningful glances with whoever else was present. She also started documenting things with her phone. If I forgot where I'd set my reading glasses, she'd casually snap a photo of me searching for them. If I asked her to repeat something because I'd been focused on something else, she'd make a note in her phone about communication difficulties. The scope of her planning became clear when I discovered she'd been cultivating relationships with my neighbors, always framing conversations around concern for my well-being. Patricia Hendricks told me about a conversation that left me speechless with rage. "Jessica stopped by last week when you were at work," Patricia said. "She seemed worried about you living alone. She asked if I'd noticed any changes in your behavior, any signs that you might not be taking care of yourself properly." "What did you say?" I asked. "I told her you seem perfectly fine to me, but she said sometimes elderly people hide their struggles well. She asked if I'd call her if I noticed anything concerning." Jessica was systematically building a network of people who might later serve as witnesses to my alleged decline. But her most audacious move was yet to come. 3 weeks before the wedding, I received a phone call that nearly stopped my heart. It was from Elder Care Services, a county agency that investigates reports of elderly people who might need intervention. "Ms. Peterson, we've received a concerned call about your well-being from a family member," the social worker explained. "We're required to follow up on all reports. Could we schedule a time to visit and assess your living situation?" "What kind of concerns were reported?" I asked, though I already knew. The caller expressed worry about your memory, your ability to maintain your home safely, and your overall capacity to make sound decisions about your care. They mentioned some incidents that suggested you might benefit from additional support. I scheduled the visit for the following week, then immediately called my attorney, David Harrison. "David, I need to see you immediately," I said. "I think someone is trying to have me declared incompetent." "That's a serious accusation, Allison," he replied. "Do you have evidence?" "More than you might imagine. Can you recommend a private investigator?" That afternoon, I met with retired FBI agent Eleanor Walsh, who now worked as a private investigator specializing in elder fraud cases. Eleanor was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense with graying blonde hair, and the kind of presence that made you immediately trust her competence. "This pattern is unfortunately common," she told me after I'd explained the situation. "Financial predators often target elderly people with significant assets, and family relationships provide the perfect cover." "What should I do?" I asked. "First, we need to document everything. I'll start a background investigation on Jessica and her mother. Second, you need to protect your assets immediately. And third, we're going to let her think her plan is working while we build a case against her." That evening, I looked at myself in the mirror and made a decision that would change everything. If Jessica wanted to play the game of making me seem like a confused old lady, I could play that role better than she ever imagined. The next phase of my life would require the performance of my lifetime. Over the following days, I began acting slightly more forgetful, asking Jessica to repeat things occasionally, expressing mild confusion about dates and appointments. I let her help me with increasing frequency, all while secretly documenting every interaction. The social worker's visit went exactly as I expected. Jessica had primed me perfectly by expressing her concerns to neighbors and friends. When the social worker arrived, she found exactly what she'd been told to look for: a slightly confused elderly woman whose young daughter-in-law was providing increasingly necessary support. "I'm so grateful for Jessica," I told the social worker, playing my part perfectly. "Sometimes I don't know what I'd do without her guidance." The social worker made notes about my mild confusion and dependence on family support, but concluded that no immediate intervention was necessary. However, she left pamphlets about resources for elderly people who might need additional assistance. Jessica found the pamphlets before I could hide them. "Oh, Allison, did someone from elder care visit?" she asked with perfectly performed surprise. "I hope I didn't overstep by expressing my concerns to them. I just worry about you so much." "You called them?" I asked, letting confusion and hurt show in my voice. "I was just scared," she said, tears forming in her eyes. "You've been seeming so overwhelmed lately, and I didn't know who else to turn to for advice." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about how completely Jessica had manipulated the situation. She'd created a paper trail of concerns, established herself as my primary caregiver, and positioned herself as the loving family member trying to help an elderly relative in decline. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. The next morning, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of Jessica meeting with a man in a suit outside a downtown office building. On the back, someone had written, "Harrison Legal Services Consultation Tuesday 2 p.m. Attached was a handwritten note. "My father went through the same thing. She almost succeeded. We need to talk. Eleanor Walsh gave me your address. Call me." The note was signed, "A Friend Who Understands." I picked up the phone and dialed the number written at the bottom of the note. A woman answered on the second ring. "Is this about Jessica Mitchell?" I asked. "Yes," came the reply, "and you're not her first victim." 2 weeks before the wedding, I began living a double life that would have impressed any method actor in Hollywood. By day, I played the increasingly confused elderly woman that Jessica needed me to be. By night, I transformed into a strategic investigator, building the case that would destroy her. The woman who'd sent me the photograph was named Sarah Chen, and her father had been Jessica's victim in Columbus, Ohio, 18 months earlier. Richard Chen had been a 72-year-old widower with a comfortable retirement account and a paid-off house in a desirable neighborhood. Jessica had met him at a grief support group 6 months after his wife's death. She used the same playbook, Sarah told me during our first phone conversation. She became his caregiver, isolated him from family, documented his decline, and nearly succeeded in having him declared incompetent. She would have gotten conservatorship of his assets if I hadn't caught on. How did you stop her? I asked. I hired Eleanor Walsh. She's based in San Francisco now, but she used to work elder fraud cases in Ohio. Eleanor helped us gather evidence and expose Jessica's pattern, but Jessica disappeared before criminal charges could be filed. So she came here and started over. With a new identity and refined techniques, we've been tracking her, hoping she'd surface again. When Eleanor mentioned your case, we knew it was the same woman. Sarah agreed to testify if needed, and she provided documentation of Jessica's previous scheme. The evidence was damning. Jessica had a criminal background in financial fraud, had changed her name twice, and had attempted the conservatorship scam at least 3 times in different states. Armed with this information, I met with Eleanor Walsh to plan our counterattack. We need irrefutable evidence of her current scheme, Eleanor explained. Audio recordings of her discussing the planned documentation of her fraudulent activities and proof of her criminal intent. How do we get that without alerting her? You're going to help her succeed, or at least let her think she's succeeding. Eleanor installed hidden cameras and recording devices throughout my house disguised as regular household items. A clock in the living room, a picture frame in the dining room, and a decorative vase in the guest room all contained sophisticated surveillance equipment. Meanwhile, I began giving Jessica exactly what she wanted, a confused, dependent elderly woman who needed increasing amounts of help and guidance. I started asking her to help me balance my checkbook, claiming the numbers didn't make sense anymore. I expressed anxiety about managing my investments, wondering aloud if I should turn over financial decisions to someone younger and more capable. "Oh, Allison, you don't need to worry about these things," Jessica would say, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Bradley and I would be happy to help you manage everything." The cameras captured every moment of these conversations, including Jessica's facial expressions when she thought I wasn't looking. The mask of concern would slip away, replaced by calculating satisfaction. During one particularly revealing conversation, Jessica brought Diane over for what she called a family planning session. "We need to talk about Allison's future," Jessica said to her mother, apparently forgetting I was in the room. "The wedding is in 2 weeks, and we need to move quickly after that." "What about the son?" Diane asked. "Is he going to be a problem?" "Bradley trusts me completely," Jessica replied. "And he's been seeing how confused his mother is getting. He'll accept that it's in her best interest." I continued puttering around the kitchen, playing the role of the elderly woman who wasn't quite following the conversation, while the hidden cameras recorded every word. "The social worker's report will help," Diane continued, "and you've been so smart about documenting all her problems." The beauty is that she's doing half the work herself," Jessica said with a laugh that chilled my blood. "Every time she forgets something or seems confused, I just make sure someone notices." "What about the accident plan?" Diane asked. My hands froze on the dish I was washing, but I forced myself to continue the motion. "After the wedding," Jessica said quietly. "A fall down the stairs, maybe. Nothing that would look suspicious, just the kind of thing that happens to elderly people who shouldn't be living alone in big houses." And then, emergency hospitalization, psychiatric evaluation, conservatorship proceedings. I'll be her devoted daughter-in-law trying to protect her from herself. I nearly dropped the plate I was holding. They weren't just planning to steal my assets. They were planning to physically harm me. That night, I called Eleanor and Agent Robert Kane, the FBI investigator she'd brought into the case. "We have enough evidence to arrest them now," Agent Kane told me after reviewing the recordings. "Conspiracy to commit elder abuse fraud and now conspiracy to commit assault." "Can we wait until after the wedding?" I asked. Both Eleanor and Agent Kane were surprised by my request. "Why would you want to wait?" Eleanor asked. "Because I want this to be as public and humiliating as possible. Jessica has spent months convincing everyone that she's my devoted daughter-in-law, and I'm a confused old woman. I want the truth revealed in front of everyone who's been watching this charade." Agent Kane considered this. "It would be helpful to catch her in the act of executing the plan, but it's risky." "She won't hurt me at the wedding," I said. "There will be too many witnesses, but she'll reveal her true nature when she thinks she's won." Over the next 2 weeks, I continued playing my role while Eleanor's team gathered additional evidence. They discovered that Jessica had stolen the identity of a real nursing student who died in a car accident 2 years earlier. They found evidence of her previous scams in 3 states. They located bank accounts where she'd hidden money stolen from other elderly victims. Most importantly, they uncovered the planned timeline for my accident. Jessica had researched my prescription medications and planned to slip me sedatives at the wedding reception, making me appear confused and unsteady. Then she'd suggest I needed to rest upstairs, where a carefully orchestrated fall would result in injuries requiring hospitalization. During my hospitalization, she'd present evidence of my mental decline to medical professionals. The social worker's report, neighbors' observations, and documented incidents of confusion would support her petition for emergency conservatorship. "It's actually quite sophisticated," Agent Kane admitted. "If she'd targeted someone without your resources and determination, she probably would have succeeded." 3 days before the wedding, Jessica made her final preparations. She brought boxes of her belongings to move into my house, permanently claiming she wanted to be there full-time after the wedding, to keep an eye on things. "I've arranged for some of my friends to help with the transition," she told me. "They're very experienced with elderly care." I knew these friends were actually part of the larger operation Sarah Chen had mentioned. Jessica wasn't working alone. She was part of a network that specialized in elder fraud. The night before the wedding, I sat in my study looking at family photos and feeling the weight of everything that was about to happen. In less than 24 hours, the woman I'd welcomed as a daughter would be exposed as a criminal who'd planned to destroy my life. Bradley still had no idea what was coming. That was perhaps the most painful part of the entire situation. My son genuinely loved this woman and believed they were building a future together. Tomorrow would shatter his world. But some truths are too dangerous to ignore, and some people too harmful to protect. I picked up my phone and sent a single text message to Agent Kane. "I'm ready." The trap was set. Tomorrow at my son's wedding, Jessica would get exactly what she'd been planning for months: the public humiliation of an elderly woman in front of 122 guests. She just didn't know the elderly woman in question would be her. The morning of Bradley's wedding dawned crisp and clear, with October sunlight streaming through the Victorian windows of my home. As I prepared for what I knew would be the most dramatic day of my life, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The wedding ceremony took place at Grace Cathedral, a beautiful stone church downtown that had been Bradley's choice. Jessica had wanted something more elaborate, but Bradley had insisted on the church, where his father's memorial service had been held. For once, her manipulation hadn't worked. I played my part perfectly throughout the ceremony. I arrived slightly late, seemed mildly confused about seating arrangements, and needed Jessica's gentle guidance to find my place in the front pew. Several guests commented on how thoughtful Jessica was to help me, and how lucky Bradley was to have found such a caring woman. Jessica looked stunning in her wedding dress, a flowing white gown that she'd purchased with my credit card, claiming it was tradition for the mother of the groom to contribute to the bride's attire. As she walked down the aisle, I saw the triumphant satisfaction in her eyes. She believed she'd won. During the reception at the elegant Fairmont Hotel, Jessica's performance reached its crescendo. She'd arranged for me to sit at the head table, where everyone could observe our interactions. Throughout dinner, she made a show of cutting my food into smaller pieces, gently correcting me when I seemed confused about people's names, and loudly expressing concern when I appeared to lose track of conversations. "Allison seems to be having one of her difficult days," she'd whisper to nearby guests just loudly enough for me to hear. "I'm worried about her." The moment I'd been waiting for came during the speeches right after Bradley's best man had finished his toast. Jessica stood up, tapping her champagne glass with a fork to get everyone's attention. I have something very important to share with everyone tonight. She announced, her voice carrying across the ballroom to all 122 guests. Bradley and I are so grateful for all your love and support, and I especially want to thank my new mother-in-law, Allison. She turned to me with what looked like genuine affection but felt like cold calculation. Allison has been so generous in welcoming me into the family, Jessica continued. In fact, she's been so generous that I think it's time she got some help managing that generosity. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as guests sensed something significant was about to happen. As many of you have noticed, Allison has been struggling lately with some confusion and memory issues. Jessica said, her tone dripping with false concern. It's become clear that she needs someone to help her with important decisions. Bradley looked confused, glancing between his new wife and me. I saw the exact moment when Jessica's meaning began to dawn on him. So tonight, in front of all our family and friends, I'm asking Allison to give me her house keys, Jessica announced. Not because I want to take anything from her, but because she needs someone to make sure she's safe and cared for. The ballroom fell silent. I could hear my own heartbeat in the sudden quiet. Jessica, what are you talking about? Bradley asked, his voice strained. Bradley, honey, we've discussed this, Jessica said smoothly. Your mother isn't capable of living alone anymore. She needs supervision, and we need to make sure her finances are properly managed. I looked around the room at all the faces staring at us. Friends, family members, coworkers, and wedding guests who'd come to celebrate what they thought was a joyous occasion. Instead, they were witnessing a public ambush designed to humiliate and control me. I don't understand, I said, letting my voice quaver slightly. Jessica, dear, what do you need my keys for? Oh, Allison, she said with that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. We need to make sure you're safe. That big house is too much for you to handle alone. She reached out her hand expectantly. The keys, please. I stared at her outstretched hand for a long moment, aware that everyone in the room was holding their breath. This was it. This was the moment Jessica had been building toward for months. No, I said quietly. What? Jessica's composure flickered. I said no. I repeated, my voice stronger now. I'm not giving you my keys. Jessica's face began to flush. Allison, you're not thinking clearly. This is for your own good. I'm thinking perfectly clearly, I replied, and I'm not giving you my house keys. The mask began to slip. Jessica's sweet demeanor cracked, revealing the cold ambition underneath. Fine, she snapped. I didn't want to do this publicly, but you're forcing my hand. She turned to address the wedding guests. What you don't understand is that Allison is no longer competent to make these decisions. I have documentation of her mental decline, and I've already begun conservatorship proceedings. She needs professional care. That's not true, Bradley said, standing up from his chair. Mom, what is she talking about? Jessica ignored him, focusing entirely on me. Allison, give me those keys right now, or I'll call Elder Services to come collect you tonight. The threat hung in the air like poison. Around us, wedding guests were shifting uncomfortably, unsure whether they were witnessing a family intervention or something more sinister. I said no, I repeated firmly. Jessica's control finally snapped completely. Her face contorted with rage, and she drew back her hand and slapped me across the face so hard that the sound echoed through the silent ballroom. The collective gasp from 122 guests was audible. Bradley shot to his feet, his face pale with shock. Diane, sitting at a nearby table, looked pleased, rather than horrified. There, Jessica said, her voice shaking with fury. Now everyone can see how difficult and unreasonable she is. She's clearly having a breakdown. I stood up slowly, my cheek burning, but my dignity intact. The entire ballroom was watching as I walked toward the exit with measured steps. Where are you going? Jessica called after me. You can't just leave, we're not finished. I turned back to face her one last time. Actually, Jessica, we are finished, and you're right about one thing. Someone is about to cry tonight. I walked out of the reception hall and into the hotel lobby, where I pulled out my cell phone and made the call I'd been planning for weeks. Agent Kane, I said when he answered. It's time. 20 minutes later, I was standing outside the reception hall doors when Agent Kane arrived with 2 other FBI agents and several local police officers. The hotel security team had quietly cleared the corridor, but no one inside the ballroom knew what was coming. "Are you ready for this, Mrs. Peterson?" Agent Kane asked. "I've been ready for months," I replied. Agent Kane opened the ballroom doors and walked inside. I followed close behind along with the other officers. Jessica was still holding court at the head table, explaining to shocked wedding guests how she'd tried to help me, but I'd become impossible to reason with. She looked up when she noticed the commotion at the entrance. When she saw Agent Kane's badge and the police officers behind him, her face went white. "FBI," Agent Kane announced, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "Jessica Mitchell, you're under arrest for elder abuse conspiracy to commit fraud and assault." The ballroom erupted in chaos. Wedding guests began standing up, craning their necks to see what was happening. Bradley stared in shock as handcuffs were placed on his new wife's wrists. "This is ridiculous," Jessica screamed. "She's the one who's confused. I was trying to help her." "Diane Mitchell, you're also under arrest as an accessory to conspiracy and fraud," Agent Kane continued as another officer moved toward Jessica's mother. Diane tried to run but was quickly apprehended near the exit. "Bradley," Jessica called out as she was led away. Tell them she needs help." But Bradley wasn't looking at Jessica anymore. He was staring at me with dawning comprehension. "Mom," he said quietly, "what's going on?" I walked over to where my son stood amid the wreckage of what should have been the happiest day of his life. "I'm sorry you had to see this," I told him, "but Jessica wasn't who you thought she was." As the officers led Jessica and Diane out of the ballroom, I heard Jessica's voice echoing down the corridor. "This isn't over. She's mentally incompetent. Someone needs to stop her." But it was over. The trap had sprung exactly as planned, and Jessica's own words and actions had provided the final evidence needed to destroy her credibility completely. 122 wedding guests had just witnessed the most dramatic revelation of their lives. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely again. The days following Bradley's wedding passed in a whirlwind of police interviews, legal proceedings, and shocking revelations that made Jessica's plan seem even more sinister than I'd initially understood. Agent Kane's investigation revealed that Jessica and Diane were part of a sophisticated elder fraud network operating across 7 Western states. The operation was more extensive and more successful than anyone had imagined. "They've been running this scam for at least 5 years," Agent Kane explained during one of our debriefing sessions. "Jessica is the front person who establishes relationships with targets. Diane handles research and documentation. Behind them is a lawyer named Marcus Webb, who specializes in emergency conservatorships, and a network of caregiver associates who move in once they gain control." The scope was staggering. They'd successfully stolen assets from at least 12 elderly victims, totaling more than $3 million in home savings accounts and investment portfolios. Sarah Chen's father in Ohio had been one of their few failures, and only because Sarah had been suspicious enough to investigate. "How did they choose their targets?" I asked. "Wealthy elderly people who were somewhat isolated," Agent Kane replied. "Usually recent widows or widowers, people who'd lost long-term companions and might be vulnerable to someone offering companionship and care." "But I wasn't recently widowed. My husband died 15 years ago." "No, but you were living alone in a valuable property and Jessica gained access through your son. Family relationships provide the perfect cover because people trust that family members have their loved ones' best interests at heart." The evidence against Jessica was overwhelming. The recordings from my house had captured her discussing every aspect of the plan, including the intended accident that would have put me in the hospital. Her laptop contained detailed files on dozens of potential targets, including photos, financial estimates, and personal information about their families and social connections. Most disturbing was the discovery of sedatives in Jessica's purse the night of the wedding. Chemical analysis confirmed they were the same drugs she'd planned to slip into my champagne during the reception. If she'd succeeded in drugging you, the fall down the stairs might have killed you, Agent Kane said grimly. These weren't people planning simple theft. They were willing to commit murder to achieve their goals. Bradley was devastated. The young man who'd been so happy and confident just days before was now grappling with the reality that the woman he'd married had been planning to harm his mother and steal his inheritance. I keep thinking about all the signs I missed, he said during one of our long conversations in the days after Jessica's arrest. How could I have been so blind? You weren't blind, I assured him. You were in love. Jessica was very good at manipulation. She'd done this before, and she'd refined her techniques with each victim. Bradley struggled with guilt over the times he'd defended Jessica against what he now realized had been my legitimate concerns. I actually got angry at you for not trusting her, he said. I told you that you were being unfair. She was counting on that reaction, I explained. Part of her strategy was isolating me from the people who might protect me. Making you feel like you had to choose between us was deliberate. The criminal investigation expanded rapidly as other victims came forward. The arrest had been covered by local news, and the publicity encouraged people who'd had similar experiences to contact authorities. Eleanor Walsh, the private investigator who'd helped me, became a crucial coordinator for the expanding case. She'd been tracking this particular network for 2 years, ever since they'd attempted to scam her own elderly uncle in Portland. The beautiful thing about this arrest is that Jessica was caught in the act, Eleanor told me. There's no way for her to claim she was just a confused young woman who made mistakes. The recordings, the planned drugging, the assault in front of witnesses, it all proves deliberate criminal intent. During the arraignment hearing, I saw Jessica for the first time since the wedding night. She looked smaller in the orange jail jumpsuit, her auburn hair pulled back severely, her face drawn with stress. When she saw me in the courtroom, her expression hardened with pure hatred. Your Honor. Jessica's public defender argued, my client was genuinely concerned about Mrs. Peterson's mental state. The actions she took were misguided attempts to help an elderly family member who was showing signs of cognitive decline. But the prosecution had too much evidence for that defense to work. The recordings of Jessica discussing the planned accident were played in open court. Her history of similar scams in other states was presented. The sedatives found in her possession were analyzed and explained. This wasn't a family member concerned about an elderly relative, the prosecutor stated. This was a predator who systematically targeted vulnerable elderly people for financial exploitation. Jessica was denied bail and ordered to remain in custody pending trial. As she was led away, she turned back and pointed at me. This isn't justice, she shouted. She's a vindictive old woman who can't stand to see someone else be happy. The courtroom was quiet as she was escorted out. Her words revealed exactly the kind of person she really was. Someone who truly believed she was entitled to take what belonged to others. Diane's case was slightly different. Unlike Jessica, she showed genuine remorse during her hearing. I got caught up in my daughter's schemes, she told the judge. After my divorce, I was angry and bitter, and Jessica convinced me that wealthy people like Mrs. Peterson had more than they deserved. I know that was wrong thinking. Diane agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony provided crucial details about how the network operated and helped identify other members of the conspiracy. The civil proceedings were almost as complex as the criminal case. Jessica and Diane had spent money stolen from other victims, making restitution complicated. But Eleanor's investigation had traced most of the assets, and a federal court ordered that everything they'd stolen be returned to victims. For me, the legal proceedings were just part of the healing process. The real work was rebuilding the relationship with my son and figuring out how to move forward with my life. Bradley insisted on moving back home temporarily, partly to help me feel safer, and partly because he needed time to process everything that had happened. I keep wondering if there's something wrong with my judgment, he told me one evening as we sat in the garden. How do I know I'll never be fooled like this again? You'll be more careful, I said. But don't let Jessica's betrayal make you stop trusting people altogether. Most people are basically good. You just ran into someone exceptional in her capacity for evil. Martha, my housekeeper, was particularly vindicated by the revelations. She'd never warmed to Jessica, though she'd been too polite to say much about it. "I knew something was wrong about that girl," Martha said. "She was too helpful, too interested in everything. Real family doesn't need to prove itself so hard." As the weeks passed, I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected: gratitude. Jessica's plan had been so complete, so carefully orchestrated, that if I hadn't discovered it when I did, she almost certainly would have succeeded. The combination of forged medical records, witness testimony about my decline, and her planned accident would have resulted in her gaining control of my life and assets. But because I'd been able to turn the tables, not only was I safe, but her entire network was being dismantled. Other elderly people who might have been targeted in the future were now protected. "You saved a lot of lives," Agent Kane told me when the investigation was finally complete. This network was getting more sophisticated and more dangerous. If they'd continued operating, they would have hurt many more people. The trial was scheduled for the following spring, but with the overwhelming evidence against her, Jessica's lawyer was already discussing a plea agreement. She faced federal charges in multiple jurisdictions, and the sentences would likely be substantial. As I prepared for the final phase of this ordeal, I realized that Jessica had given me an unexpected gift. She'd forced me to prove to myself that I was still strong, still clever, still capable of protecting myself and the people I loved. The scared, confused elderly woman she'd tried to create never really existed, but the strong, determined woman who defeated her had been there all along, just waiting for the right moment to emerge. 6 months after the wedding that became an arrest, I sat in a federal courthouse, watching Jessica receive a sentence of 15 years in federal prison. The judge's words were measured and severe. "Mrs. Mitchell, you and your associates preyed upon elderly citizens who deserved protection and respect," Judge Patricia Torres stated. "Instead of honoring the trust placed in you as a family member, you planned to steal, deceive, and physically harm a woman who welcomed you with open arms. This court finds your actions particularly reprehensible because they exploited the natural desire of elderly people to trust and care for their families." Jessica showed no remorse even in the face of overwhelming evidence. As the bailiff led her away, she turned back toward me one final time. "You'll die alone in that big house," she called out. "Just a bitter old woman with no one who really loves you." Her words might have stung 6 months earlier, but now they bounced off me like raindrops. I knew exactly who loved me and who deserved my love in return. Diane received 8 years in a federal facility. Unlike her daughter, she had shown genuine remorse and had provided testimony that helped convict other members of the elder fraud network. During her sentencing, she asked to address me directly. "Mrs. Peterson, I know my apology can't undo the harm we planned to cause you," she said, her voice shaking. "But I want you to know that watching you fight back made me realize how wrong we were. I hope someday you can forgive a foolish woman who let bitterness turn her into someone she never should have become." I nodded acknowledgement but said nothing. Forgiveness might come in time, but justice had to come first. The civil proceedings resulted in full restitution for all victims. The network had stolen over $3 million in assets, but Eleanor's meticulous investigation had traced most of the money. More importantly, the federal court established a fund to help other elderly fraud victims recover their losses and rebuild their lives. The broader impact of the case extended far beyond our courtroom. The FBI used the evidence we'd gathered to dismantle similar networks operating in other regions. Agent Kane estimated that our investigation had prevented dozens of additional elderly people from being victimized. "Your willingness to put yourself at risk to gather evidence made all the difference," he told me after the final sentencing hearing. "Most victims of elder fraud don't have the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively." Bradley and I spent months rebuilding our relationship and processing everything that had happened. He struggled with guilt over how thoroughly Jessica had manipulated him, but gradually, he began to understand that he'd been a victim too. "She chose me specifically because I trusted easily," he said during one of our long conversations, "and because getting close to me gave her access to you." "That's exactly right," I agreed. "You were kind and loving and she exploited those qualities. Don't let her betrayal make you cynical." Bradley took a leave of absence from work to help me process all the legal and emotional aftermath of the case. During those months, I watched my son rediscover his confidence and judgment. When he eventually started dating again, I was pleased to see that he was more cautious, but not hardened. Martha proved to be a treasure during this entire ordeal. Her loyalty and practical support had been invaluable, but more than that, her friendship had reminded me what genuine caring looked like. "I knew that girl was trouble from the first day," Martha said as we worked together in the garden one afternoon. "She smiled too much and asked too many questions." "Why didn't you say something earlier?" I asked. "Would you have listened?" Martha replied with a knowing smile. "Sometimes people have to discover things for themselves." Eleanor Walsh became not just a professional associate, but a genuine friend. Having survived similar situations with her own family, she understood the complex emotions involved in protecting yourself from people who claim to love you. "The hardest part isn't fighting back," Eleanor told me. "It's trusting again after someone has tried to manipulate you so completely." But trust did return gradually and more selectively than before. I learned to distinguish between people who cared about me and people who cared about what I could provide them. The difference, once you know what to look for, is unmistakable. My real estate business flourished as word of the case spread throughout the industry. Other elderly property owners sought me out for advice about protecting their assets from family members or caregivers who might not have their best interests at heart. I established the Peterson Foundation for Elder Protection, using part of my resources to provide legal assistance and investigation services for elderly people who suspected they were being exploited. Eleanor became the foundation's chief investigator, and we helped dozens of families navigate situations similar to what I'd experienced. Bradley eventually met Sarah, a teacher who appreciated both his kindness and his hard-won wisdom about recognizing manipulation. When he brought her home for dinner, I watched carefully for red flags, but found only genuine warmth and respect. Sarah was interested in the house's history and architecture, but she asked about my experiences restoring it, rather than inquiring about its value. She brought flowers from her own garden, rather than expensive gifts. Most tellingly, when Bradley got called away to handle a work emergency, Sarah and I continued our conversation naturally, rather than her seeming lost without his presence to charm. "She likes you for who you are," I told Bradley after that first dinner, "not for what you represent or what you might provide her." The house that Jessica had tried to steal became more beautiful than ever. Without the tension and manipulation that had poisoned the atmosphere during her presence, the rooms felt warm and welcoming again. I hosted dinner parties for genuine friends, fundraising events for the Elder Protection Foundation, and family gatherings that celebrated real relationships rather than performing fake ones. Carlos, my gardener, continued maintaining the grounds he'd helped save by alerting me to Jessica's suspicious phone calls. Martha continued keeping house now with the satisfaction of knowing her instincts about Jessica had been completely correct. Dr. Williams, my physician, used her experience with Jessica's manipulation attempts to educate other medical professionals about recognizing signs of elder abuse. 1 year after the wedding, I hosted a celebration dinner for everyone who'd helped expose Jessica's conspiracy. Agent Kane, Eleanor Sarah Chen, from Ohio Bradley, Martha Carlos, and several other friends gathered in the dining room that Jessica had once planned to claim as her own. "To truth," I said, raising my glass as we began the evening, "and to the people who have the courage to seek it and defend it." "To Allison," Eleanor responded, "who turned a victim's story into a victory that protects countless other people." As I looked around the table at faces of people who genuinely cared about my well-being, I reflected on the lessons Jessica had inadvertently taught me. I'd learned that my instincts were reliable, that my strength was greater than I'd realized, and that real love never demands you surrender your dignity or independence. Most importantly, I'd learned that protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. When someone tries to manipulate or exploit you, fighting back isn't mean or vindictive. It's an act of self-respect that can protect other potential victims too. The house where Jessica had planned to imprison me became a symbol of freedom and strength. Every room held memories of my victory over her manipulation. The study where she'd photographed my financial documents now housed case files for the foundation. The guest room where she'd hidden legal articles about conservatorships became Bradley and Sarah's room when they visited. As I tucked myself into bed each night in the master bedroom that Jessica had planned to claim, I felt profound gratitude for the dramatic series of events that had revealed her true nature. If she'd been more patient, more subtle, she might have succeeded in her plan, but her greed and arrogance had caused her to overreach, and her own actions had provided the evidence needed to destroy her. The foundation continued to grow, helping elderly people across the country recognize and resist financial exploitation. We published guides for families about recognizing elder abuse, provided legal resources for victims, and trained law enforcement agencies to investigate these complex cases more effectively. Jessica thought she was targeting one vulnerable elderly woman, Agent Kane said during a foundation fundraising event. Instead, she awakened a force for protecting elderly people everywhere. 2 years later, I received a letter from Jessica in federal prison. She was requesting my assistance with an appeal claiming that her sentence was too harsh and that she'd been motivated by genuine concern for my well-being. I read the letter once, then fed it into my paper shredder. Some people never learn, never change, never accept responsibility for their actions. Jessica would spend the next 13 years in federal custody, and when she was released, she'd be a middle-aged woman with a felony record that would make it difficult for her to victimize anyone else. Meanwhile, I would continue living in my beautiful house surrounded by people who love me for who I am rather than what I own. The woman Jessica had tried to create, confused, helpless, dependent, had never existed, but the woman who defeated her had been stronger than either of us had imagined. Every morning I wake up in a home that belongs to me, surrounded by relationships built on truth and mutual respect. I've learned that real family doesn't demand your keys. They earn your trust. True love doesn't require you to surrender your independence. It celebrates your strength. Jessica taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. I am not a victim waiting to happen. I am a strong, intelligent woman capable of protecting myself and others. And that knowledge has made everything else possible. The house she tried to steal has become a fortress of genuine love, meaningful work, and authentic relationships. And every day I get to wake up here is a victory over everyone who thinks elderly people are easy targets. That's a pretty good way to spend the rest of your life. I'd love to hear from you about this story. Have you ever had to deal with someone in your family who tried to manipulate or take advantage of you? How did you recognize the warning signs, and what did you do to protect yourself? Your experiences could help other people facing similar situations. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you. If you found this story helpful, please subscribe to hear more stories about real people standing up for themselves and protecting what matters most. These stories matter because they show that we're stronger than we think, and that standing up to manipulators and bullies can protect not just ourselves, but other potential victims too. Please share this with anyone who might benefit from hearing about recognizing and resisting elder abuse or family manipulation. Together, we can help people understand that they have the right to protect themselves and the power to fight back when necessary. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it reminds you that you're stronger than you know and that your instincts are worth trusting. Take care of yourselves and remember that real love never demands you surrender your dignity.